tell this story if you don't mind, Uncle Jack. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto?
I'm not going to give you the answer before the story unfolds.
Correct.
So when I did the Danny Jones podcast, we never got to this point because he didn't want to go down the Zionist, Jewish, Mossad angle. So I have to give you some background because we haven't talked about the main player. So the main player is a guy that comes over in 1911. His name is Meyer Lansky. Comes over with another guy named...
This is the same guy that's in, I think, Boardwalk Empire, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
And Mo Dallas, and another guy that they made a movie about, you've probably heard of, Bugsy Siegel. And what happens is these guys start out in the Jewish mob that was mostly in the Midwest, like Detroit, Cleveland, that area. And remember, Woodrow Wilson passes not only the Federal Reserve Act around this time, but also the income tax law. So what's the first thing that these new guys, immigrants that are coming over, they have to figure out how to launder money. So where does laundering money, the term, come from? Mo Dallas, Bugsy Siegel, and Meyer Lansky use laundromats in this part of the United States to circumvent the income tax. Then they do something even crazier. They know that prohibition is coming. They connect with the Bronfins. You know, the Bronfins to this very day, also Jewish immigrants, live in Canada, but they were also based in the United States. Lansky becomes their front. What is Lansky's claim to fame? He's an idiot savant when it comes to money. Like, you give him the rules of engagement, he'll figure out how to get around the system. So he then is the major salesman, both in New York, in the Midwest, and eventually to the rest of the world through all of Prohibition. He makes the Bronfins fabulously wealthy. This is obviously when he gets on the radar of all the people, you know, in the FBI. Remember, the FBI forms in 1908. This is right around the same time. Lansky realizes he has to stay one up on the lawmen. So what's one of the things that he's famous for? All the things that you hear about Mr. Epstein, Lansky is the architect of this whole plan. He's the one that set up pedo rings, sex rings, all kinds of traps, and he ensnares the early FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh, this is a blackmail thing.
Correct. And that's how he got him. He got caught up in Lansky's blackmail thing. But as I told your compatriot earlier, Lansky was smart. Lansky never had assets tied to him. He controlled people. And what did he do? By keeping J. Edgar Hoover clean. Like, none of the stuff, all the stuff what we know about J. Edgar Hoover today comes out way after J. Edgar Hoover's out of power. Lansky uses this to control him his whole entire life, all the way until the 70s, okay? So Lansky becomes extremely popular, grows up while he's a young immigrant, and meets Lucky Luciano. That's the Italian mob. The Italian mob is the shoot 'em up guys. The Jewish mob are the guys that are the bankers. They become the accountants for Murder, Inc. They form a criminal enterprise. This would be like a RICO, a conspiracy. And Lucky Luciano really took a liking to Lansky. And then when they found out how talented Lansky was, that he could figure out financing for any deal that they want to do, Lansky business acumen is brought into the Italian families. And he's elevated. He's so elevated that the story that you know about later, when Bugsy Siegel is killed by the Italian mob, you don't know that there was 3 attempts on his life. Meyer Lansky stopped the first 2 because Lucky Luciano knew. What was the first 2 attempts about? Is Mo Dallas and Siegel setting up Vegas in the desert, which was the craziest idea ever. But why did they seek the desert? This is how the Jewish immigrants thought. Like, why do we want to stay in New York or in Detroit or Cleveland? Let's go where there's nobody at. Nevada, in a desert. There's nobody here. It's the Wild West.
No law.
There's no law. That's actually their original mindset. And when they sold that to the Italian mob, they're like, okay, this makes sense. Wasn't their big play. Their big play was down in Cuba. Then magically, what happens? The deal in Vegas continues to lose money, but then the the revolution with Castro happens and the moneymaker goes bye-bye. So that's when the Italian mob turns around and says, look, we're spending millions of dollars here. We're not getting a return on our investment. We're going to kill Siegel. Lansky cockblocks it twice. Finally, the last time he couldn't cockblock it, the mob takes out Siegel in the Beverly Hills Hotel. I think it's like 1940, 43, somewhere around there. What happens within 2 hours of the hit? Mo Dalitz, Cohen, and Dalitz, I should say, and Meyer Lansky walk in to the Flamingo Hotel. Everything is turned over to these two guys. Within the first 60 days, they remove the clocks, they paint the glass, and they bring the one-armed bandits in. Why does this all happen? This all happens because Mo Dalitz, not Meyer Lansky, asks a question of the guys gambling. We noticed that our takes all go down right around 5 or 6 o'clock. And they're like, yeah, the reason it goes down is because you guys don't have any food here for us to eat. There's no drinks. So the first thing he does, he sets up buffets. So the big buffets that, were a staple of when I grew up in Vegas, not when you guys grew up.
No, they're still there, actually.
Well,
I lived there 5 years.
All right.
There's an echo of them, yes.
Well, this became a feature of Las Vegas from the mid-1940s all the way in through. This stuff happens in Cuba. Then they paint the windows. Like if you know the downtown, I think it's Fremont Street.
Yeah.
That casino was the first one that has its windows painted right on the street.
Golden Nugget?
No, it wasn't a Golden Nugget. It's the one that's on that street. I can't remember the name of it, but I think it's called the Fremont Casino.
Yeah, it's Fremont Street. Yeah, there's a Fremont Casino. Yeah.
I think that's the one that I'm talking about. That's where they do the test case before they do the Flamingo.
Yeah.
And then the clocks are gone. And what do they know within 2 months? The Italian mob starts seeing the prices go up. So this is not any science at all. This is just Jewish mobsters being crafty and paying attention to their customers.
Sure.
And what Dalitz finds is that he doesn't have to hold people up. He actually can feed them, give them alcohol, put girls in skimpy costumes, and next thing you know, they're staying all night. So the coffers go up. So guess what happens? Not as profitable as the other casinos that they have in Cuba. But then when Castro happens, there's a huge void.
Right.
It's only Vegas. So then Dalitz really ramps it up. And Meyer Lansky, at this time, this is all going on. If you remember the story that I told in other podcasts, and we tangentially tied to it, how does Lansky become the rock star of the industrial military complex? So remember we talked briefly about the Manhattan Project. Why does it have the name Manhattan? Well, when it started, it was on the 67th floor of the Empire State Building. Okay? That's where it started, 1942. This is after Einstein's letter to FDR in 39, warning that the Nazis are going to be building a bomb. They take the threat as credible. What do they do then? General Groves replaces Albert Compton. Compton is a scientist. You may not know this, but Compton scattering from X-rays, that's what it's named after this guy. He's a very accomplished scientist. Groves replaces him. What's Groves' claim to fame? West Point, MIT trained. He's an engineer and a military man. He's going to lead the biggest engineering project in the history of the world. So he turns around to the two guys that FDR hooks him up with, which are the two Pilgrim guys. That's John Foster Douglas and Allen Dulles. And he sends them to Europe to procure the scientist that Einstein tells Groves you need to get as part of this program. Dulles goes over there, and that gets the name Operation Paperclip. Many people who listen to your podcast, who's listened to Danny's, thinks that Operation Paperclip started after the war. It's not true. It started before the war. That's actually how we got the guys. Groves makes a big decision. This is where Oak Ridge, Tennessee is made. This is also where Hanover, Washington is made. They're going to be doing the uranium and the plutonium. And then the key point is going to be the University of Chicago, which we've talked about already.
Yeah.
This is where Fermi is, and this is where the two doctors that came into the story later trained at. So in 1942, the war is on. If you know anything about the war, the United States not only got their ass kicked at Pearl Harbor, but they also get their ass kicked in Midway. We win the Battle of Midway, but we lost a lot of our Pacific force. So the United States is effectively already fighting a two-front war. Eisenhower, Patton, MacArthur are fighting the Nazis in Europe. So FDR gets reports that there's U-boat scientists and U-boat spies coming into New York Harbor to find out why General Gross hired all these Jewish scientists and brought them to the United States in 1939, 1940, 1941, and 1942. So General Gross tells FDR, we got a problem. We can't defend New York Harbor. We're just too spread thin. He says, but I have an idea. He goes, the guys that control the docks or the longshoremen, they're all tied to the mob. Let's bring the mob in and ask them for help. I mean, because this their jobs as well, even though they're criminals.
Right.
So FDR looks at him and thinks he's crazy. And he says, okay. And they bring Lansky in. So FDR says to Lansky, we want your help to patrol the docks on the Brooklyn Navy yards. If you find any U-boats, any Nazis, and you know, Lansky's believing the story that you believe prior to our discussion about Hitler's a bad guy and they killed the Jews and all that. So Lansky goes, yeah, I'd be more than happy to be a patriot and help you out. I've made a good living in this country. But he goes, you have to do something for me. He goes, you got to get Lucky Luciano out of the maximum security prison so that we can run our business together. Wow. So why do I tell you this part of the story? Because I want you to fact check what I just told you, because you can. You'll actually see he's moved right at this time. The next part of the story, you're not going to know too much about. You'll know a little bit, but not everything. Literally within the first month of the mob patrolling the docks, they find 19 spies. They kill 18 of them, but they keep one guy. You know why they keep the guy? He's got a very interesting story. He started off as an SS surgeon. He's a doctor. His name is Kurt Plotner. Plotner tells Lansky, he goes that they're doing some very interesting things in the concentration camps. They're making people docile to make them easy to control. They're using fluoride to do that. He goes, and then they're using other chemicals. The specific one is mescaline peyote. And he goes, well, why are they doing it? He goes, they're doing all kinds of experiments to try to control people and do this because they're moving them to different parts of the globe. And Plotner never knows where they're moving them, but this ties into the story I told you before. This is the transfer agreement that Hitler makes with the royal family to get people to Palestine. And Lansky finds this story very interesting. He also finds out that the Jews aren't being killed by the Nazis from this guy. He goes, no, that's not the plan. Our job is to take their money, put it in a Rothschild bank. Hitler took the bank, but the Rothschilds would get the money back. As soon as he hears that, he goes, wait a minute. He goes, you're going to tell me that they're taking these people's money, putting in a bank, and the Rothschilds are getting that money and they're going to repatriate them when they get to Israel? Lansky knows right away this is a total bullshit story. He begins to realize that the royal family and the Rothschilds set this whole story up. So what does Lansky do? Lansky goes and tells FDR and the people in the military, this is before the military is corrupted, what this plan is. This shocks the people in the U.S. military, but it makes Lansky a rock star. Why? Because he, in fact, finds the problem in New York Harbor when no one else could do it. But Lansky goes and tells the people who will become the Mossad, the Israeli Defense Forces. Remember, because Israel's not a country. It doesn't become a country until 48. He tells them the same information he tells the Americans. So everything goes hunky-dory. The Germans can't get into the States. You know that we're successful. So what happens after the war, you know, the blow up with Castro and the mob. Castro nationalizes the casinos. The mob loses money. Lansky walks into a casino in Havana the day before the revolution and takes $3 million out. The FBI and the CIA knows that. That money is never found ever again. We think that money was used for them to build up Vegas. No one knows that for sure. The data trail that I found goes back to a Jewish lawyer that's still alive today in Florida, close to where you live. His name's Ira Malnick.
Yeah.
And Malnick is the opposite of Lansky. Lansky lived his whole life like, you know, he's a Bitcoin bum. You can't find out any money he's got. You know, he lived like a pauper. But this guy Malnick, he lives in a $60 million house in South Florida.
Keep it skinny, right?
Yeah. And to this very day, he's a really, really powerful guy and does a lot of work with both the Italian and Jewish mob. And Lansky goes back, makes Vegas with Modalitz extremely successful. Anybody who doesn't know the story of Modalitz, you can literally get on the internet right now and look it up, and you can see what he did. Both of these guys, two Jewish guys, never get in any trouble. I'm talking about trouble like the Italian mob gets in, ever in their whole life. But what does J. Edgar Hoover do? J. Edgar Hoover knows that Lansky caught him in this homosexual tryst, and he's got pictures. Lansky's the one that caught JFK. He's the one that caught Bobby Kennedy Sr. He's the one that caught Marilyn Monroe. He's the one that actually even set up all the stuff that the CIA was doing, you know, with Jolly West. If in case you don't know who Jolly West was, Danny got involved with this in his podcast.
I was just saying he was blackmailing all these people.
Oh, yeah. But he was also the banker for General Groves. General Groves gets thrown out of the military. Why? Because Eisenhower, Patton, and MacArthur thought that Groves was going to try to take credit for winning the war by dropping the 2 bombs. And he goes, wait a minute, we're out here fighting the war, and you have a bunch of Jewish scientists making a bomb, and you think you're going to get credit? And this infuriated Eisenhower. So what happens? Eisenhower basically makes it miserable for Groves. Groves gets excommunicated from the military in 47, but the way out the door, he's the guy that set up the first military coup. Remember I told you that the military was pure, but it went bad? Yeah. What is the line in the sand?
41?
No, the line in the sand for the military when they go fraudulent was the 4th election for FDR. The vice president for FDR for those 3 times is a guy named Henry Wallace. Best way for me to describe him to you today, it's like seeing Bernie Sanders. Henry Wallace gives a speech in 1942 that after the war, he sees the future of America as a common man. Well, you can only imagine Groves is doing the Manhattan Project, building these bombs. And he's like, that's not my vision for what the future is. My vision for the future is the military is going to be strong and da-da-da-da-da. And in the 4th term, the polio / Guillain-Barré is getting so bad, Groves knows that FDR is going to die. So he goes to the most powerful guy in the U.S. Senate, is a guy named Jimmy Burns from South Carolina. Jimmy Burns holds this distinction. He's the only person in U.S. history that's been Secretary of State, Senate, and a House of Representatives. No one's ever held all 3 positions.
Oh.
So Jimmy Burns gets the DNC to deinstall Wallace and put up a no-name Manchurian candidate. Who is that? Harry Truman. He's a senator from Missouri. So literally, the DNC in December of 44 gets stopped by Jimmy Burns. Magically, in those 9 minutes, they close all the voting. Henry Wallace led the first 3 ballots. Next day he comes in, everything gets completely flipped. They make all kinds of backdoor deals in Chicago. Truman's in. Why? Because Groves knows that he can control Truman. What was the control card that he used? When he got thrown out of the military, he had Henry Truman put in the National Security Act that got the CIA in. CIA is all of his friends, George Kennan, Wild Bill Donovan, the Dulles brothers. Got it? And when he goes outside, remember, I want you to think...
The CIA was in charge of the country at this point?
Correct. They weren't in charge truly of the country. Still, I would tell you, the Joint Chiefs, the Eisenhowers, the MacArthurs, they were powerful. The president still had a lot of power. But because Truman is in, Truman didn't even know the bomb existed the first 2 months that he was president. You know who told him? Not Groves, Jimmy Burns. And because he tells him, Truman makes Jimmy Burns the Secretary of State. Turns out, why does that become important in this whole historical story? Remember I told you about Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam? Potsdam is when Churchill, Stalin, and Truman meet. Everything that was promised by FDR at the other two meetings to Russia gets flipped on a dime because Burns tells Truman, you tell him he's now the enemy. We're not rebuilding Russia. We're just going to rebuild Europe. And just so you know, the Marshal, General Marshal, he's also a Pilgrim guy and also a Council of Foreign Relations guy. Just so you know who we're dealing with. So what I'm telling you is everything goes awry when they push General Groves outside. What happens? Eisenhower thinks he's okay with this. Who's Eisenhower's vice president? Nixon. Nixon thinks he's okay. General Groves needs to have money because, you know, he's a military guy. He doesn't have any cash. He goes out and becomes CEO of Remington Rand. Remington Rand is the #1 weapons supplier of the U.S. military. General Groves is in a position to know that because he had the highest security clearance. He becomes a messenger, and then he finds another company, very crazily, called Burroughs. Burroughs sells calculators, mini computers, flashlights, but they're big electronics. He merges the two together. You know what those two companies become? Sperry. What does Sperry get renamed? Gets renamed Unisys. What does Sperry do in this whole time outside the military? They make UNIVAC computers. UNIVAC computers that they wind up selling back to the U.S. military. Do you know why? Because in 1957, the Russians put Sputnik up in space. And this caught Nixon and Eisenhower completely by surprise. But guess who didn't catch by surprise? Groves, because Groves knew what was going on because of his time in the Manhattan Project. That's when Eisenhower has to bring Groves and his industrial military complex back into the federal government. What was that called in 1958, Robert? DARPA. First name was ARPA. What was the first project that ARPA did? First thing Groves did, he linked Stanford, Johns Hopkins, all the little colleges that you learned about in COVID together with a computer network. Got it? Something else happens. Eisenhower changes the name in 58 to DARPA. And then I already told you about Eisenhower's little farewell speech and that the biggest risk. Why? Because he didn't trust Groves at any level. This proves to you that I'm right. But what's happening outside the scenes? How does Groves get the money? He starts working with Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky is bringing Groves money left and right, hand over fist. Who introduces Groves to Howard Hughes? Meyer Lansky. So guess why Howard Hughes is linked to this whole story? Because he now becomes the benefactor. He's like the Rockefeller that wasn't tied to the banking institution. He was the bank for Meyer Lansky and General Groves that fueled the growth of the industrial military complex outside the military. So when General Groves retires, he's officially done in 61. Remember, all his people now are brought back in for 3 years into Eisenhower's White House. We have the election, Kennedy comes in, you know the story there. Meyer Lansky, now J. Edgar Hoover is on his ass about that $3 million I told you he found. We have the best forensic accountants in the world in the IRS, and they can't find out a goddamn place where this money went. Like, it's like it vanished from the face of the earth. J. Edgar Hoover is beside himself because he knows that he has to get Lansky on some kind of deal like they got Capone, like tax evasion, to get him and sidetrack him from being a problem for him. So what effectively happens is they can't catch anybody in Vegas for almost 13 years. And then we have a change with LBJ coming in into Nixon. And Ira Malnick finds out. Ira Malnick, just so you know, how did he become tight with the military? He worked in U.S. Army intelligence 53 through 57. So that's why he's connected the story. How did I find all this out? I found this out when I met with Becker at our famous 2007 meeting, because he's the one that figured out who canceled him. It was all the guys in the industrial military complex. So when I started to learn about all these things that Lansky was doing, I thought it was interesting. Becker told me something that I will never forget. And I thought it was a minor part of the story. He said, Jack, have you ever looked at the Munitions Act that was created after World War II? And I said, no. He goes, you're going to find something very interesting. Cryptography is part of the Munitions Act.
Right.
And do you know why that was the case? He's the one that clued me in. He goes, because Turing didn't do what everybody thinks he did. He was sending messages from the royal family and the Rothschilds to the Nazis. That was the only way they had communication. The second way is what I told you. The King of Spain had a cousin that was a runner between the papacy and there. That's how they kept the connection going. And the reason why they made it part of the Munitions Act is because it was so successful that nobody ever found out the real story, what Turing was really up to.
Right. This came up decades later with a BitTorrent case where they're trying to,
Correct.
I'm sorry, PGP, not BitTorrent.
Right.
Pretty good privacy software. Yeah, they were trying to classify the munitions to prevent its exploitation.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that's what brings us to the next part of the story. So in the 60s, J. Edgar Hoover is going fucking crazy to figure out what happens. And Ira Malnick found out that J. Edgar Hoover has got a subpoena out in 68. This is at the end of LBJ's reign, and Nixon's coming in. So they know there's going to be a change of AGs between Ramsey Hunt and Nixon's guy, who's going to be John Mitchell. And Ira tells Lansky, look, the Israel guys set up a program that they had for Lee Harvey Oswald when they tried to kill Castro with the SV-40 Laden cigar. That's why he was able to go to Soviet and come back in, so that Castro would think he was a commie. And so Israel came up with the idea that any Jew, no matter what's in your history, you can come back to Israel and they'll give you protection and give you a passport. So he tells Lansky, to avoid the subpoena, you may want to go and do this. So Lansky's really pissed off. He's like, look, I helped these cocksuckers. I set them up in the military. This guy and the FBI, because remember, the FBI at this time and the CIA, they're like two separate wings of intelligence. One is international, one is homebound. And Lansky's really linked to the CIA side and to the guys that are running the military. So he's furious because he feels like he's been fucked because he's been a patriot this whole time. So he goes, okay, to Ira, he goes, hold my beer. He goes to Israel in 1969, avoids the subpoena. Finally, the new Attorney General, John Mitchell, gets Israel to allow them to talk to Lansky. And then Lansky, before he has the famous meeting, calls in the Mossad, calls in the guys that are the prime minister. I think it was Golda Meir at the time. And he said, I'm going to do something unusual. It's going to make all of you feel uncomfortable. He goes, I'm going to tell them the truth. And they look at him like, what do you mean you're going to tell them the truth? And this is just like the Top Gun story. I'm going to let him come closer. None of them have any clue about what he's about to do. So he was working with two people, a guy named Bill Hamilton and his wife. They came up with some weird software right at this time. It's called the Promise software, Promis. This was used in attorney general's offices, okay, that they could keep up their case log. It turns out that it had a back door on it. It actually gave Lansky access to the IRS computer. And he knew everything the Federal Reserve was doing before they did it for a long period of time. And he was having his computer people update this information. And what else was he doing? He used the Promise software to infect just about every single big government around. Why? He wasn't interested in doing the things the CIA does. He was interested in staying in front of the Rothschilds because he was fucking furious at them for using Jews as a pawn. Because remember, he's a Russian Jew that made good.
Yeah.
He's a Jew. He's not a fucking Zionist.
Right.
He's okay with Israel, but he's like, you can't use people as a human shield. And if there's one thing that you'll learn about Lansky, when you do the deep dive on him, it just almost sounds like an oxymoron to say he's an ethical criminal. He's like, if you can't beat them at their own game, you shouldn't play dirty. So he goes in and meets the people in Israel and tells the fucking IRS and the US Fed I've been fucking watching you guys for 20 years. I know everything you're going to do before you do it. And he shows them how the money is corrupted. The fucking government is stunned. So now you as a Bitcoiner probably are beginning to understand, so this is why 1971 really happens. What happens in 1970, my friend? We get the Bank Secrecy Act. What do you and I call that? The AML KYC laws, right? Because the guys in the Fed realize that the system is really corrupted. In other words, they don't have the control. Turns out this guy who's the accountant for Murder Inc. has been playing them for literally 30 years. Running General Groves' shadow government.
This is a centralization problem too.
You got it, brother. So you probably are thinking, why would he bring them closer? Because he wanted the fucking Rothschilds and Rockefellers to know who they were fucking with. He goes, I helped you guys during the war. I helped you doing this, and you're going to come after me for $3 million from a casino in Cuba? I'm going to make this hurt. So, 71, we get the Nixon shock. Why? Because now the guys who are in the Federal Reserve realize that fiat money is corruptible and it has to be blown up because they can't use it anymore, because Lansky's tracking everybody all over the world. He knows exactly what's going on. Then he goes the craziest step ever. He says, if you want to fix your problem, you need to computerize your money. He said, you know all those computers that I had General Groves build, the UNIVAC ones, and they sold them to Eisenhower and Nixon? He goes, that's what you need to do. No, just remember who's the president now. Nixon. He's no longer the vice president. He's the president. That's where the Nixon shock comes from. It's not the story that the Bitcoiners, and they have their little websites, want to tell you. So
Nixon shock is a response to
Lansky
these guys
subpoena.
realizing they're getting backdoored.
Oh yeah.
So
Total
what is it about going off a gold standard that solved that problem at all for them?
Well, because they knew that Lansky knew everything it was about them. In other words, Lansky could rug pull them anytime.
Okay.
Like he could out them to the whole world, then their shell game is over.
Okay.
So he tells them, you need to come up.
Oh, so he was probably
Blackmail them just like he did with J. Edgar Hoover.
So he's seeing
Keep
that.
them under your thumb and control them.
Right.
Make them useful idiots.
But the blackmailing probably in this case would have been the fractional reserve banking that they're running?
Correct.
Okay. Wow.
So what does he do?
And this is why when we went off the gold standard, the estimate was there's 6 to 1 dollar liabilities to gold in reserve. So that was probably the fraud that was getting exposed.
Correct.
Or could have been exposed.
Could have been exposed. And it could have blown up the entire system. That's where the Federal Reserve Act goes. But remember what I told you about Lansky? Lansky's not interested in revenge. Lansky has always been interested in control. So he wanted the guys that have Rothschild Drive in Tel Aviv to know, I got you by the balls. And he wanted the guys in the Fed in all 12 cities to know, I got you by the balls too. And he wanted to let them know that the CIA was their partner. In other words, that's when everybody's now playing naked at the card table.
Wow.
Got it?
Yeah.
So what does Lansky do? This is the most amazing part of the story. When you dive deep and do your due diligence, you would think that they'd fucking suicide this guy or kill him. They were so afraid of him because guess what? Of all his friends in the mob, they knew what they were capable of doing. They killed the fucking president. Yeah. So they knew the deal. But when the new AG comes in for Mitchell, realize that this is the time Watergate's going on. What's his name? E.L. Hunt is in there. This is when all the JFK starting to go. This guy Hunt exposes to the Watergate people. G. Gordon Liddy's in there. This is CIA guys. Nixon has an AG that's only present, I believe, for 8 or 9 months. He goes from like February to December. That's the guy. His name's Robinson. He wants to nail Lansky to the wall. And Nixon goes, we're not going to do that. Nixon then changes the AG to a Zionist. His name is Levi. Levi is in cahoots. He's a dual passport guy, the United States and Israel. He understands the game that's going on. Guess what happens to Lansky in 1973-74? He walks out with an acquittal that says, well, he's going to die soon, so we're not going to go after him. Want to hear the funniest part of the story? Go look at Meyer Lansky's charge sheet and then go look at Russ Ulbricht's charge sheet. You know what you're going to see? Almost exactly the same.
What, he was running a marketplace?
You should look at it sometime. These are discoverable documents, my
Yeah.
friend. What I'm going to tell you is Ross got his penalty because they were punishing Meyer Lansky. So now, because they never got him before. So what's the real story? Remember what Silk Road was? It was a drug for Bitcoin kind of shit, right?
Yeah, it's open marketplace. People sold a lot of drugs on there.
What did Lansky do? Same fucking thing. Except he did it using fiat money without a computer token. So it brings us to the story that most Bitcoiners want to hear. That's why you asked me the question 45 minutes ago before we went through this random walk. So Lansky walks out of jail in 73, tells Ira Malnick, go find me the smartest IT guys in the world because we need to build another system that can stay ahead of the system that I just sold these guys with the UNIVAC computers from Unisys. So what does he do? He finds this young little Jewish guy named David Shum. David Shum, you should know as a Bitcoiner.
Show me an e-cash.
Right. But what's the key thing that you need to know about David Shum that's very unusual? You know anything about his family? Have you ever done a deep dive on his family? Robert, he comes from no money. Absolutely no money at all. Like, we're talking poor people. But do you know what's really unusual about David Shum? You need to look into it. As soon as he finishes at Cal, he opens 4 international companies in the Netherlands. Is that cheap? You know how much it cost to open up a company in 1981, 82 in the Netherlands? And here's the interesting thing. Go look at the 4 companies he opens up. One of them is on cryptography. One of them's on a peer-to-peer system. But you know what the other one's on? It's the forerunner of Dominion voting machines. You think they may be trying to game the system even further to their advantage? So what does Shum do? This is the part where I can skip through because I think most of the Bitcoiners know it. Shum works from 1981 all the way through, I'd say 98. That's when his company, Digicash, goes bankrupt. But what's his claim to fame in that whole time? Lansky knows to set up another system. He's trying to set up a peer-to-peer system that's for Murder, Inc., the CIA, and the industrial military complex. How did I get tuned into all this? I went back and read the Warren Commission, and I found the CIA and in the Warren Commission and Lansky have the same personal banker. His name's M. Pinsky. And I saw it in there, and I started to do the deep dive through there. That name Pinsky came up in a lot of Ira Malnick shell companies in Florida. So I started to realize what happened. Lansky made sure that Malnick held no money. All of that money went to David Shum. Shum is the one that set up all of this stuff. And he was told at the time, if you go back and look at what Shum's initial paperwork's all about, it's about things that would be related to the Bank Secrecy Act that no one else would know. Like, there was no impetus in this time in the United States to come up with these ideas. It's almost like they came out of the mist. It's almost like the Callie and Cassie Means people. Like, they just show up and want to talk about Fruit Loops and why they're so bad and don't worry about the jabs. Well, Shum continues on and goes on. And then some very, very interesting things happen. He comes up with blind signatures, and he comes up with shuffle and mixed networks. Those become the key to the work that he's doing in Digicash. How impressive does it get? It gets so impressive that he gets 5,000 customers. Who's one of the customers? Deutsche Bank, Central Bank of Germany. Any guesses how that happened? Through our friends. They're trying to keep tabs on what the hell's going on. Who else? Mark Twain Bank in the United States is the other big customer. Guess who owns that bank? Not anybody associated with the Federal Reserve. So this is a bank that's controlled by the mob. And what are they trying to do? They are trying to take the idea of Lansky, the ideation, get to the execution. Shum's the executor, to make it come to fruition. What magically happens? Lansky dies in 83, so the mastermind is gone. Shum has got the idea. all the guys that you know about in the Jewish mob, they're still around, but they're not as powerful as Lansky. This is when the Italian mob starts falling apart. This is the times of John Gotti. This is the times of money laundering. This is when they take out Paul Castellano. And you have Mena, Arkansas. You have Bill Clinton.
Are they using the legal system to take down the Italian mafia at that time?
No. Actually, what Lansky was doing is trying to build his own private peer-to-peer network so he could move money all around with nobody knowing about it, not even the IRS computer. So Sham is the guy that's in control of all this. But what happens? Sham open sources it, you know, right around, I think it was 87, 88, 89. What is that? Who lets the door in then? That's where the Cypherpunks come in. So it goes open source.
Right.
That's when Murder Inc. and the Jewish mob lose control of the project. This turns out to be the best thing ever for Robert Breedlove and Uncle Jack.
So Shom saved the day.
I wouldn't say he saved the day. It's kind of like...
Well, it would have never happened had he not open sourced it, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, but he had to open source it because he didn't have the power that he needed from all the different people that were putting their 2 cents in. The most interesting part of the story is how Digicash goes by the wayside. It's sold on the courthouse steps in 1998. You know who buys it? A guy named Naveen Jan. You know anything about Naveen Jan? Because we're getting ready to tie the General Groves bow in a knot here so you can see where it comes. Naveen Jan is part of a company named Infosys. Infosys was Google before Google was Google.
Right.
Okay? And they also are tied into search, surveillance, and algorithms. They're also tied to General Groves' friends in Silicon Valley. He knows that this is ultimately tied to what Meyer Lansky's plan is. Do you know why? You know where Naveen Jan comes from? India. And when he comes over, guess who's the first company he works for? Burroughs. Remember who Burroughs was? That merged with Remington Rand.
Yeah.
So he knew that the keys to General Groves' plan about setting up a private bank with peer-to-peer cash flows was buried in what Sham was working in. But since it was being sold at the courthouse steps, he bought it all. But he had no idea how to deal with it. So who did Jan wind up working for later? Microsoft. Believe it or not, Bill Gates almost tried in 1994 to buy Digicash because he also knew. Who else was involved with all this? Peter Thiel and the PayPal mafia, Elon Musk. They knew about this as well to this very day. But Jan takes it, goes through the wind, and then magically this young kid shows up who's a PhD candidate of David Sham's in the Netherlands. You know what his name is? Len Sassaman. Len Sassaman is Satoshi Nakamoto. Because what does he do? He realizes immediately what Sham didn't, what Adam Back didn't realize. Everybody in Bitcoin gives Adam Back deference like he's the Pope. Uncle Jack's the only guy that doesn't. Because Adam Back's part is this big. Turns out when Sassaman looks at it, do you know what his claim to fame was? At 18 years old, he gets tied into building the TCP IP network for Tor and the dark web. Okay?
Yeah.
This is ultimately where Ross is going to cut his teeth. He does all the basic work for this, and he realizes through those shuffling networks and how they work that timestamping is the single most important part of this mechanism. And what does he do? 3 parts in the white paper. What did I say from Bitcoin Prague? The thing that struck me when Jack Dorsey handed me the white paper the first time. I said, this is just like circadian biology. It's timestamping, and it turns out it doesn't work with quantum time, not time relativity. It's actually Newtonian time. It rejects seconds, hours, and minutes for 10 minutes, 10-minute blocks. And the reason why he had to do that is because what he learned in Tor is that in order to make it work, you had a timestamp to make things connect. That's exactly what happens in us. You got it. So he's the one that puts the entire system together. And then magically, what happens? Where does this tie in?
And so he was then marrying Adam Back's proof of work to Digicash.
Correct.
And applying
timestamping is
part of proof of work, though, right?
It is, but not the way Sassaman does it.
Okay.
And the key is the most important part of Bitcoin isn't the proof of work mechanism. It's the timestamp.
Right.
Because guess what? If time is relative, you can't have an immutable ledger. The
Yeah,
fact
and you
that
can't
time,
have an immutable ledger without the expenditure of energy.
correct.
They're both
But,
necessary.
but remember, that's entropy. And entropy, everything that deals with a clock, all clocks are is flow meters of entropy. That's the brilliance of Len Sassaman. He figures that out, comes up with the white paper, and as a solution, the reason why
it's a universal flow meter for entropy.
you got it. That's exactly what it is. And see, it made sense to me because here I am as the mitochondriac, which is the time machine in us. Bitcoin is the time machine in money. And the craziest part of the story is if it doesn't go open source and Sassaman isn't the PhD candidate of Sham in Amsterdam or in Belgium,
Yeah.
dude, this confluence never happens. And here's where it crashes back on me. How does Sassaman get taken out? Why does it make sense why he fell off the face of the earth? At 18 years old, since he's a tech abuser like Dorsey was, he gets horrible depression. The depression goes into other mental illness. He develops a functional neurologic deficit. That functional neurologic deficit is why he kills himself. So in other words, non-native EMF, the stuff that you asked me about earlier, this story is tied to Bitcoin. So now, when you ask me the story of Hal Finney, do you understand why I went to Bitcoin Prague and I said the things I said? Why? Because my understanding of Bitcoin is radically different than Saylor's, radically different than yours, radically different than everybody else. Why? Because it's the timing. That's the key. And if you know anything about physics, which I know Saylor does, but here's the thing that you and Saylor never talked about in your big time controls the flow of energy over matter.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is all about time.
Well, then it's power, right? It's
You got
energy
it.
per unit time.
Right.
So yeah, which money is power.
Correct.
So no, that's fucking fantastic. So how do you get the evidence to support that conclusion? I mean, obviously you've painted a very brilliant narrative. Like, where did you find that?
All
How did you figure that out?
all the homework that I did chasing down the Lansky story.
And so
Why? Because this
also,
whole thing was tied,
yeah.
again, because we didn't get into this so far on the podcast. All of this was tied to my belief as a young man, young resident, that the United States doesn't get back on its feet until we put the people who killed JFK in jail.
Right.
And it turns out that Lansky and the Bitcoin story
Right.
crash into this way. And it's my work on Lansky that brought me to Sham. Like when you learned about Sham, like when my friends in Bitcoin learned about Sham, they knew about Sham a different way. I didn't know anything about Sham
Right.
on the cryptography side.
So is it fair to say then that Meyer Lansky's attempt to outsmart centralized money powers and stay one step ahead of them is the legacy that gave rise to the ideas that were precursor to Bitcoin and ultimately became Bitcoin? Because Bitcoin is this long sequence of ideas and trial and error, right? And then eventually all the pieces are put together properly.
I'm gonna phrase it for you without the word salad you just gave. Meyer Lansky is the idiot. But I'm gonna say Meyer Lansky is the idiot savant of Bitcoin.
Okay.
And the reason why is, remember what I told you his claim to fame was? He was an accountant and he knew about math and money. He wasn't a cryptographer, but he knew
Yeah.
where the answer lied, and he controlled people to actually get the answer. And the craziest part of the story is Lansky's able to do this from the grave. And actually Satoshi, Len Sassaman, I believe also lights that from the grave. And the reason why I think this story is important is because this is where I got my piece. I've always believed, because you heard what I said about COVID, that the people that killed JFK, I need their heads on a platter before I'd be okay with this. And it turns out, when I figured all this stuff out about Lansky, Sassaman, and Bitcoin, I realized that we had their heads. I realized that the people that needed to be penalized are now going to be penalized. And now when I see the current events that are unfolding right now, you can imagine how I see these things compared to how most other Bitcoiners see them, and why I'm kind of okay
Yeah.
with the narrative that's there. Why? Because I may not get to see it, Robert, in my life, But the one nice thing about sharing this story with you as a young Bitcoiner, you're going to be alive and you're going to remember this day when you heard the story the first time. And you're going to check things off. This got fixed. This got fixed. This got fixed. All the things, because the greatest idea got open sourced and we got immutable money. We got money that you can't fuck with. This is what Meyer Lansky basically, in my head,
Yeah.
I can envision him saying to the intelligence agencies when they had him on the subpoena, what he said to J. Edgar Hoover, what he said to Nixon's AG. Like, you think you're going to put me in jail after I helped you find Kurt Plotner and figure out who your enemies really were? That it wasn't Germany? It was really the fuckers that were running the bank? I mean, dude, I got to be honest with you. I don't know of a more satisfying ending
That's a fucking...
than...
What do you say about the difference between truth and fiction is that fiction has to make sense?
Correct.
And then this is...
I told that to Bobby at our podcast because I think that one of the things that people don't understand, that's where the conspiracy thing comes up.
Yeah.
People think that the truth has to make sense, and it doesn't. It turns out that,
That would be an amazing movie. Everything you just laid out would be
well, Rick Rubin has
Bitcoin's
said,
blockbuster moment.
well, Rick Rubin has said that he wants to do a project about this, but to be honest with you, the last 18 months, all the podcasts that I've done, I've not laid out the whole story. Like, even in what we've talked about so far today, we didn't get deep into the JFK part. We didn't get deep into, you know, those parts.
We're not done. Should we take a break and
Yeah, that's fine.
jump into JFK? It's fucking great, man.
If you enjoyed this clip, click here for the full episode and here for more just like it. Also, like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money and subscribe to stay connected. Thank you.